In this lecture, we're looking at Calvin and the execution of Servetus in Geneva in 1553. And the importance of this lecture is not only in terms of understanding Calvin and addressing one of the major controversies of his life, but also coming to terms with where this execution fits in the development of European views on execution for heresy, as well as the legacy, both in terms of Protestantism and in terms of those who flowed out of a more radical spirit within the Reformation that gave rise later to a number of groups and churches and break-off groups who identify even to this day as followers or heirs to the teachings of Servetus. And we can begin by just commenting on the fact that whenever this issue, this execution of Servetus, is brought up, a bit too often there are two responses. On the one hand, there is utter revulsion. There is blame cast on Calvin or on Protestantism in general, but Calvin always seems to be the tyrant, the man who executed someone for differing with him on his theology. And this revulsion against Calvin is sometimes, depending on the group, depending on the person, carried down even to those who today appreciate Calvin's theology or who align themselves with denominations that might generally be considered Reformed or Calvinistic. So, for example, many in the Unitarian Church look to men like Servetus as the forerunners to their perspectives on the faith today. It doesn't take much, really only a Google search, to find a number of modern takes on Calvin and Servetus, written by those, say, from the Unitarian Church or from another perspective, that really toes this same line. Sometimes the abuse and the outrage, in particular against Calvin, is so great that there really is no reasoning with someone from this perspective. No amount of evidence, no amount of context, no amount of historical research is going to convince them that Calvin in particular, or Protestantism in general, was all too medieval or all too Catholic in the sense of the Inquisition when it comes to the execution of Servetus. Well, if that's one far end of the spectrum, on the opposite end of the spectrum are those who merely shrug their shoulders and for a variety of reasons simply say, well, this is just that time. Calvin really didn't do anything wrong. This is just the way of the world in the 16th century, purely. Some will cite the fact that Calvin was on the outs at this time with the Genevan magistrates, that while they consulted his opinion, they actually didn't allow him to do much in terms of the trial, and actually, in many ways, they kept him out of the situation entirely because they didn't want Calvin determining the outcome of the trial. They, meaning the magistrates of Geneva, wanted to draw yet another line in the sand for Calvin and put him in his place. So again, on the other end of the spectrum, you have either those who say that this is not as big of a deal as some make it out to be, or, particularly those who are appreciative of Calvin or who are Calvinists, there is a ready defense, not always based on the evidence or on historical research, that what Calvin did here was perfectly normal. Now, the problem with either of these extremes is they're relatively based on conspiracy theories. On the one hand, you have this belief in the modern world by some that there is this ongoing genealogy from Servetus to them, and since Servetus functions more like a hero for them, a forefather, a forerunner, evidence in either direction is always interpreted in the light of the innocence of Servetus, and on the bloodthirstiness and the totalitarianism and the lack of a willingness to deal with those who differ from them in Geneva. On the other hand, on the other side, those who like Calvin or those who don't like this genealogy tend to push a bit too hard in the opposite direction. And what we're going to do right now is sue for peace. We're going to sue for an actual historical perspective on this. Because the fact of the matter is both have elements that are true. Calvin and Geneva did have a great deal of complexity involved when it came to the trial itself. And we're going to cover some of those here in this lecture. As we'll say throughout, Servetus is something of a wanted man in a number of different capacities. He equally would have been executed in a Catholic city. In fact, we'll say he nearly was, as he was executed in Geneva. Also, as we'll say in this lecture, Servetus did some very strange things for a man who wants to simply disagree with Calvin and stay aloof from the situation and simply go on about his views. Servetus, in some ways, attempts to almost affect his own martyrdom. If he's a man who wants to simply have his own views and be left alone, well, some of his choices for not getting killed either means he was crazy or he was dumb. And we know he wasn't dumb. He was actually quite the intellectual. And I'm not willing to say that he was crazy, but I am saying that there is something apocalyptic in Servetus, where he is almost, by this point in his life, seeking it out. For the other side, though, simply shrugging shoulders and simply saying that this is not an issue, that this was just the way the day worked, is also lacking in historical merit. The fact is that the execution of Servetus in Geneva was an international celebrity-making moment for Geneva and for Calvin. Within 4 years, in fact, of the execution of Servetus, there were already being printed in Protestant cities tracts that decried the bloodthirstiness of the city for their cruelty in executing him. And always in these situations, Calvin comes out the worst. So even by the standards of that day, Calvin is being attacked, and Geneva in general is being attacked for this decision. So it's not simply just part of the 16th century, though in a minute we'll look at some of the places where persecution and execution for heresy was happening all around the world. But rather, the story, as it comes out of the historical record and from the documents that we have, is a bit different from either of these two extremes. And just to put us all on the same page, I'm going to say right now, the missing link in this story from most people historically is that they don't know what's happening in Europe, by and large, in places like Germany and England and other areas. Because while the execution of a heretic was always a possibility in the 16th century, what is happening in the 1550s is a real complex political and theological debate, you might say, amongst Protestants and even some Catholics as to whether or not heresy should always be persecuted or should always receive capital punishment. And so what happens is the execution of Servetus draws out two different people. It draws out, on the one hand, those who do not like Calvin, and there were a number based either on their personal animosity for the man, having either come to a squabble with him in Geneva or somewhere else, or amongst some humanists, they did not like his theology, just as they didn't like the theology of Luther. But what happens, rather, is the execution of Servetus comes at a time when persecution and wars and calamities were really on the rise. In fact, from the 1550s on, you have an increased militarization of both Catholics and Protestants, and a pretty steep increase over at least a span of a couple of decades of the fighting and the persecution and the tight-fisted grip across Europe of certain cities and segments for either the Protestant faith or for the Catholic faith. And what begins to happen is some are pushing back on this, and so the execution of Servetus becomes really the acid test, a breaking point for some people as to what change they wanted in Europe when it came to the treatment of those who were deemed to be heretics. Okay, so let's tell the story, and then let's give some context. By 1553, Calvin and Servetus had known each other for well over 20 years. This is one of the little wrinkles of the historical record that's often overlooked. They were both in Paris together, when Calvin was a young humanist, when he was just coming into his own, and not long, in fact, just on the eve of his fleeing from Paris and from France for the Swiss regions. Servetus's circle, those who were attracted to some of his teachings, were there in the city of Paris. And Calvin tells us, and reminds Servetus in a letter, that the two of them had actually nearly met to discuss and debate some of these issues, all the way back in 1534. Now, 1534, you'll remember in Calvin's biography, is just about the time when he is potentially going to be sought out for heresy himself, and he's going to be pushed away. It's in this context that we have the Nicholas Kopp affair and the affair of the placards, both of which ultimately send Calvin down into the Swiss Alps. Well, for whatever reason, we're not quite sure, Servetus had actually called for a meeting. Now again, Servetus at this point is already known as a radical, and we'll talk about his theology in just a second, but he's already at this point known as a real rabble-rouser when it comes to his theological position. Servetus is not simply just any old humanist there in the city of Paris. What seems to be happening, rather, is that Servetus had an eye for those who were on the fringes, those who were making the leap, perhaps, from humanism into the Protestant Reformation. And in this context, in the 1530s, it seems as if what Servetus wants is to potentially recruit Calvin, or at the very least, he wants to debate Calvin on a number of points. And this really is symptomatic of who Servetus was. He was a man who liked to fight, hot-blooded, face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball. And he had called for this meeting in 1534, and Calvin had showed up, but Servetus didn't. So for a number of years after this, for all the way down until the execution of Servetus in 1553, Calvin and Servetus are actually aware of each other. They're not friends, they're not colleagues, they don't actually seek each other out per se in the early years. But Servetus, in particular, always has his eye on Calvin. In fact, the earliest theological treatise that Calvin ever wrote was called the Psychopannychia. And this was a text in which Calvin laid out that he was opposed to the teachings of soul sleep. And soul sleep teachings are a bit complex. There were some in the early years of the Reformation who believed that the soul upon death doesn't actually ascend to heaven, it does not go before the throne, it does not meet Christ, but rather it sleeps, you might say, until the resurrection. And this seems to have been some of the things that Servetus was pushing against, traditional doctrines and coming up with alternative views. Now, Servetus isn't the only one to teach this, so it's a bit challenging to say that Calvin is writing this specifically against Servetus. But Calvin does believe that there are some, not a small number in fact, who are going too far in their rejection of traditional doctrines. We'll fast forward through Calvin's first stint in Geneva, to his exile to Strasbourg, to now him returning to Geneva. In 1546, suddenly Calvin and Servetus begin to exchange a number of letters. And what happens from 1546 on, in a very strange way, frankly, and this is the part of the historical record that we just can't quite get our arms around, Servetus, without any hyperbole, really becomes obsessed with Calvin. He's almost a stalker. He repeatedly pummels Calvin with letters. He expects Calvin to write him back on every point. He's also very, very hyperbolic, Servetus is. Most of his letters and his treatises all claim to have discovered some eureka, earth-shattering, cataclysmic view on the scriptures or on theology. And frankly, some of Servetus's claims, the braggadocio that he has, is just a bit too much. I mean, Ancient Alien sometimes has less hyperbole than Servetus does in some of his letters and his books. But what's interesting is that in 1546, Calvin doesn't really seek Servetus out. He responds to one of his tracts, but by and large, Calvin is aware of Servetus. He doesn't like his teachings, but he leaves him relatively alone. And it was in the 1540s that Servetus began to float the idea that he would come to Geneva, where he and Calvin would engage and spar with one another. Calvin's response in this time was, "Don't come." He says, "Your views are well known. In fact, they're quite problematic. People are looking for you at this point in your life, Servetus." And he tells him that he cannot guarantee his safety should he come to Geneva. And he says, anyway, quote, "My authority is of no avail." Now, sometimes people see this and they think Calvin is lying, that he's just kind of brushing off and blaming others for the ominous tone that he's giving Servetus here, that if he comes to Geneva, he's going to be executed. But Calvin says, it won't be me, it'll be somebody else. Well, as we've seen repeatedly, in the context of the 1540s and the 1550s, Calvin is actually increasingly under fire. The magistrates continually put Calvin in a box. They continually draw the line in the sand, and they always want Calvin to be one of their henchmen, one of the people that they've hired, and not the top dog, you might say, in the city in terms of its decision-making. So when Calvin says that his authority is of no avail, he's not lying. We have numerous other letters on other matters from this same period to all of his friends in the Swiss regions, where he's describing how much opposition he has in general amongst the magistrates. Now, it's not so much opposition that they kick him out again, but at one point he says, if he were to say the sky is blue, then some who govern the city would come up with an alternative color just to spite him. So Calvin's not lying here. Calvin doesn't want Servetus to come to Geneva, but he does say, if you were to come, and if I were to even attempt to give you free passage to come and debate for a while, I can't even guarantee that they would obey, that they would take my word for it and allow you to leave. Now, right then and there, it should be pointed out that Calvin from the 1540s is telling Servetus, don't come to Geneva. Stay away. Again, one of the big mysteries. Why in the world does Servetus come? We really don't know. And by and large, the situation goes a bit cold. Calvin essentially writes Servetus off as a man who won't budge an inch on any of his views. Well, what were his views? Well, unfortunately, too much is made of Servetus being something of a proto-Enlightenment rationalist. It's sometimes alleged, and this really does come about later when men like Voltaire and others in the Enlightenment actually cite Servetus as one of their predecessors. Servetus was a scientist. He was a doctor. It is to Servetus, for example, that the credit goes for discovering that the circulatory system was based on the pulmonary system itself, Now, it's sometimes said that Servetus discovered circulation itself. That's not the case. Or some have said that he discovered what the heart does. That's also overstated. Rather, what Servetus' claim was, historically, scientifically, was that the heart's primary function was to drive the circulation of the blood through the body. So right then and there, you have a man who is a scientist in a manner of speaking. He's a bit of a rationalist. But, unfortunately, this later Enlightenment view of Servetus is a bit off. Servetus' views are essentially that if anyone says it Catholic or Protestant, he really wants to take it down. There is some sort of radical commitment to the idea that all of these doctrines, just about any of them, frankly, that have arisen in church history are not based on Scripture. He challenges just about every doctrine, and he pokes everyone in the eye. He claims, for example, that the papacy is the invention of the devil. And again, his hermeneutic seems to be that anything that arose in church history as a result is de facto Catholic and therefore diabolical. So, for example, he denies the doctrine of original sin, doesn't believe that there is a need for a full atonement from Christ as God come down. He also denies fully the Trinity. He has a relatively concocted, strange set of views about the Trinity that are somewhat Arian, somewhat pantheistic. He doesn't believe that the Son of God is a creature per se. He believes that he is some sort of manifestation of who God is in this world. Well, the bedrock view that Servetus has, though, is something like pantheism. In fact, it is relatively purely pantheistic. He says that God and the world, the creation, are not separate. And in fact, God is somehow in all of the world itself. He is somehow manifested personally in every living thing, and therefore there is no separation between creator and creature. He also has weird, somewhat Manichaean views about demons and demonic activity and the role of the divinity within them. Now, a lot of this is well known in the evidence and in the secondary sources. The one that's always overlooked, though, is that Servetus was apocalyptic. Servetus believed that the end of the world was going to happen by the end of the 16th century. He believed that the archangel Gabriel was going to come and that a number of features were going to happen and that the world was going to come to an end. That factor, that last piece, is frankly the one that's always missing. Because Servetus is apocalyptic, he's millenarian. He believes that humanity and all the things that Europe is going through means that he and others are not long for this world. And he never quite says, but it is almost certainly the case that because that apocalypticism was driving him, that by 1553, Servetus essentially believes that martyrdom is his only option. Frankly, it's one of the only ways to describe what he does. Again, the obsession with Calvin, the constant desire to rile everyone up, frankly, the attacking of all kinds of doctrines, the allegations and the hyperbole that he uses, is meant to drive people crazy. He is trying to get a rise out of people. And again, he is obsessed with Calvin. In 1553, Servetus again goes after Calvin in an attempt to start a correspondence with Calvin on the issues of Servetus' theology. In 1553, Servetus had printed up one of his tracts, one of his more inflammatory ones, in which he attacked all kinds of things about the church. And it was published anonymously, but he sends this book and 30 unanswered letters to Calvin. And he complains that Calvin won't write him back. Now, I don't know about you, but after probably letter 20, I probably would have given up. Servetus doesn't want to give up, though. He wants Calvin's response. He is banging on the door saying, "Let me in, I want to talk." Well, it's at this point in 1553 that Calvin writes a letter to the city of Vienna and lets them know that Servetus is living there in the city. After Paris, Servetus had turned to taking a number of aliases, changed his name different times, and he would go around serving as a doctor, as a way to make money. Now, what's interesting about this is Servetus, again, is constantly seeking Calvin's response to this. And it does seem that Calvin knew he was in Vienna for quite some time. But it was only in 1553, when Servetus would not let up, that he wrote to the city of Vienna. They discovered that he was Servetus, and they arrested him. Now, in an alternative universe somewhere, the city of Vienna would have had a better prison system. Because here's the thing, Vienna is Catholic. They are not Protestant. They have arrested Servetus, and they are going to put him on trial. And again, in an alternative universe, they would have been the ones blamed for this execution. Calvin would have just been the one who tipped him off. But for whatever reason, Servetus very easily escapes, and he flees. Now, what happens next is almost incomprehensible. unless you take into account Servetus' apocalyptic vision of what's going to happen either to himself or by the end of the 16th century. Because Calvin again has said, do not come to Geneva. He's warned him. He has spoken actually quite harshly that he thinks his views are utterly heretical. And yet, in the summer of 1553, as Calvin was preaching, suddenly it was noticed that there on the front row was Servetus himself, and he was arrested. Well, once he was arrested, then Pandora's box was essentially opened. All kinds of problems began to arise. The contextual issues that we've already mentioned, that Calvin is not one to be sort of trusted to make all the decisions for Geneva on his own, reared their head here. Calvin was invited and instructed repeatedly to provide documentation theologically as to where Servetus was wrong. And Calvin does this. He speaks actually very negatively of Servetus and very hostilely in terms of his estimation of the moral virtue of Servetus, saying essentially that he's a fanatic and a man who's just sort of raving. However, Calvin had a number of reasons to believe that he was in the right to be this hostile. Because here's the thing, in 1531, before Calvin had fled to Paris, Servetus for a time had landed in the city of Bern and Strasbourg, and he had been nearly arrested at the time and nearly executed at the time for some of his views. There was the man Acquaintences, one of the early Reformed voices there in the Swiss regions, and he had actually nearly done the same thing that Calvin had done. Calvin cites this in the context of the trial of Servetus. The other factor that's in play here is that Geneva really can't do much on its own without making sure that the people that are their allies are on their side. So what happens is first they write to the city of Vienna and they ask for a consult as to why Vienna had arrested this man. And that's actually telling. They don't actually take Calvin's word for it that Servetus is a heretic. They take it into account for sure. But it's not enough simply that Calvin and the College of Pastors there in the city of Geneva have declared him to be a heretic. They start asking around for all the political entities in their orbit to weigh in as well. Vienna actually writes back after the letter arrives and says, yes, thank you. Yeah, we're not sure what happened to him. He kind of got away from us there. Vienna actually requests that they send Servetus back to Vienna so that they could execute him. And Geneva, of course, says no to this. The next step is that not once, but twice, letters went out to the Swiss cities of Zurich and Bern and Basel and a couple of other smaller ones, requesting that they weigh in on the subject. And overall, the opinion that came back from these Swiss regions was unanimous. Bullinger, in fact, took Calvin's side entirely and was just as scathing and just as hostile to Servetus. And so Zurich sides entirely with Geneva. Bern and Basel and these other cities do nearly the same amount of siding with Geneva in terms of wanting to get rid of this man. However, they're relatively halting in terms of what their judgment is as to how this should be handled. What's interesting about Calvin during this, though, is he actually says that he hopes that the judgment is death, that there is a command given that Servetus would be put to death. But he writes to Farel, his hope was that the judgment would be mitigated, that perhaps he would just simply be left in jail. Now, that might be small beans for some people, but here we see Calvin doing something that is very 16th century. You see, because in this day and age, the majority of folks believed that heresy was not simply a difference of opinion, but rather that it was a moral blight that always had the potential to corrupt an entire city and an entire populace. Radical views, in other words, were always believed to be the first crack in the armor that leads people to riots, to protests, and to uprisings that are violent, bloody, and crazy. This was, in other words, a time when all kinds of people are being executed for their faith if they're deemed to be radical or heretical. This is a time when Anabaptists are being dunked and drowned in lakes and rivers because of their views on baptism. 1553, by the way, is also the time when Mary Tudor comes to the throne, and she will be relatively hostile, burning and executing nearly 300 Protestant leaders from the English world, forcing 1,000 or so others to flee to the continent. So this is a bloody time. Geneva actually is uncertain repeatedly as to what they're going to do. They know that he is a heretic, but they're not sure how to handle this. Frankly, they probably would have been better off just to send it back to Vienna and let them handle it. But there is this sense that they have to do what is right because they have him, and frankly, because he's already escaped from Vienna once, why risk it? And so in the end, in 1553, Servetus is burned at the stake. Geneva decided to take the position of the other Reformed cities, and because of Bullinger's stature, they took his side as well as Calvin's, though they decided not to mitigate the death. Calvin again stepped in, though, once the death sentence had been passed, arguing that burning at the stake was not the best way to treat a heretic, and he argued instead for a more merciful beheading, which is a swift death. Burning at the stake takes somewhere around 30 minutes as the person roasts to death, and it's utter agony. Well, in the end, Servetus is executed. A letter shows up to Calvin not long after from Melanchthon, in which he praises Calvin and takes his side for having executed Servetus, adding Melanchthon to one of the number of those who were actually on the side of Geneva. Now, the problem is most people stop right there and they say, okay, everyone was on board with this. This was just the 16th century, and this is what happened. What's missing, though, is this is not how the story unfolds for the several years after the execution of Servetus. Again, the missing link here is that with the rise of persecutions and the increased militarization of armies and kingdoms throughout Europe for their faith, there were some, particularly amongst the humanist world, those who were in exile and those who had suffered much, many of whom had landed in the Swiss regions, who looked aghast on this, even if they believed that Servetus was a heretic. It's in the 1550s, for example, that Charles V militarizes, and he and the Smalcaldic Leagues go to war. And I've already mentioned Mary Tudor and the attempt to reimpose Catholicism on England. And there are a number of others. But here's the thing. There is a growing minority voice of humanists and those who were in exile or who had been persecuted, who were sick to their stomachs, frankly, at the rise of violence. And so it's these folks, the increased sense amongst Europeans that the execution of someone for heresy is not the way that Protestants should act, who began to champion Servetus for all of Europe to see. In 1557, there is published a work called A History of the Death of Servetus, and in it Calvin comes off as a tyrant. And there are others as well. And over time, the story of Calvin and Servetus becomes embroidered amongst those who are attempting rhetorically and in terms of their championing of Servetus as a martyr to provoke in Europe, not just in Geneva, but throughout Europe as a whole, the cessation of the execution of heretics. The other factor is in the Swiss regions, there were pockets of places where people shared some of Servetus' views. Italian evangelicals and others dabbled with anti-Trinitarianism as well. And so for Servetus to be killed for this, and here they are as Italians in exile up in the Swiss regions, meant that a number of them were really, really concerned about this. And so it's not the case that the execution of Servetus was just common cause, common issues, the sort of standard fare for the day. While he would have been executed in other cities, what happens because it happened in Geneva, and because there are people who want to attack Calvin to begin with, and because there are people who want to attack burning at the stake in general, is this issue becomes an international cause for crisis, concern, and debate. In other words, the execution of Servetus is a result of the way the 16th century normally handled heresy, but it's also the provocation of a new wing of voices that are beginning to say that this needs to stop. Now again, the expansion of the story and the way that it is embroidered over the years is unfortunate because it simply allows people, even in the modern world, to paint Calvin as the one man, seemingly, who ever took part in an execution in the 16th century. So, for example, there was added the belief that when the fire was lit underneath Servetus, that Calvin smiled. Well, there's no evidence for this. It's not in any of the historical records. This is made up by one of those who were attacking Calvin, by someone who wasn't even there. And so the story has grown with the telling. I think a modern perspective of the Servetus execution is, again, a blending of both extremes. I don't think anyone in the 21st century ought to be happy that a man got executed for his views. The defense of Calvin, in a manner of speaking, ought to only be based on the historical record. But we can also say that this is a bloody age, and it didn't begin nor did it end with the execution of Servetus. And we can be happy that we are not executing people for heresy. But we can also say that this should not happen, that this is not something that Christians ought to do, that roasting a man alive is not the way to deal with heresy. But still, Calvin is not really the monster here. One of the things that actually becomes apparent after the controversy begins to arrive, in particular after these books begin to be published about Calvin, is a number of the other reformers kind of take a step back, and they let a lot of the judgment, frankly, fall on Calvin. And it's really to their discredit for this. Melanchthon, for example, was friends with one of the men who was publishing a book against Calvin. And he actually writes to him and essentially sides with him, entirely avoiding and ignoring the fact that he had written a letter to Calvin saying, "Good job on the execution of Servetus." This actually, frankly, ruined their relationship nearly for the rest of their lives. Others, of course, simply let the weight of the problem fall on Calvin. But also, some of the attacks, frankly, came from people who didn't give a rip about Servetus, who didn't like Calvin for other doctrines. There were people, for example, who wrote positively of Servetus merely to attack Calvin's doctrine of predestination, which was really not at all the issue between Servetus and Calvin. In other words, people do somewhat pile up on Calvin, and I think from the advantage of the historical record, a lot of that myth-making about Calvin the tyrant, the evil man who burns people alive, needs to be thrown out the window, even if we affirm that the judgment of a heretic should never lead to his burning. Okay, that's it. In our next lecture, we're going to wrap up the biography of Calvin by looking at his final years and his eventual death.